Nurse.org and Major League Sports teams are honoring nurses with discounted game tickets and once-in-a-lifetime experiences. From throwing the first pitch to riding the Zamboni to on-court recognition, join the fun. Visit nurse.org/nurse night to find a nurse appreciation event near you and grab your discounted tickets today. You're listening to Nurse Converse, presented by Nurse.org, a collaborative podcast amplifying diverse nurse voices. Get ready for a dose of inspiration, a sprinkle of education, and a whole lot of community.
Have you ever wondered if you're getting paid fairly, or how to even go about getting paid fairly? If so, you're in for a treat, because today Nurse.org and Emory University are partnering to host a podcast mini-series on nurse empowerment and advocacy. My name is Mathewos. I'm a certified nurse executive, leadership coach, and Nurse.org contributor. Today, I'll be speaking with two Emory University professors, Kim and Katarina, to garner insight and tools on how to get best compensated and negotiate. So, hi ladies, how are you today?
Hi, good morning.
Great. I love the topic.
Yes. If you would, and we'll just go in alphabetical order. Katarina, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself. What do you do? And why are you interested in this topic?
Sure. Thank you. Good morning. So really excited to be here today with the two of you. So I am an assistant professor of organization management at Emory University's business school, so Goizueta Business School. I have been here for a few years. Before this, I got my PhD at Harvard University. I also have an MBA from the school as well. And so I teach negotiations. That is what I do at the business school here. So I teach to both undergrads and MBA students. And in terms of my research, so as an academic, I do both the teaching and the research. And research, I broadly study teams. And within teams, the topic that really has fascinated me since the beginning of my PhD is sort of the hierarchy dynamics that happen in the context of teams. And quite honestly, that's one of the reasons why I am really interested in healthcare is the hierarchy dynamics in healthcare are really pronounced. They're really meaningful. They affect a lot of what happens in the field. And so that's really why I've found myself a lot of times thinking about, hierarchy and team problems, and then finding the context of healthcare a really interesting setting to think about it. So if I can put a plug in there also, if anyone listening happens to have, personal experience or be interested in this topic and sort of the hierarchy dynamics around them, I would love to, please reach out, and I would love to talk. Yeah, so that's me. Thank you for hosting.
Of course. Thank you for sharing. And I feel like there's that, and I'm sure it'll come up today, the hierarchy and how it relates to negotiation and that impact, especially in healthcare. All right, Kim.
Thank you. I am a professor at the School of Nursing at Emory University. I hire and develop the faculty, so I negotiate starting contracts with our faculty and negotiate incentive bonuses and things like that. I'm currently in Atlanta at Emory. Prior to that, I was on the West Coast for 20 years. I was a dean. I was a researcher. I was an educator, an academic. I've also worked as a nurse practitioner in a variety of outpatient care settings, which has different negotiation and salary strategies. I've also been a nurse in the hospital, which I think is probably the most challenging negotiation strategies. So I'm just excited to contribute to our listeners that might be a nurse at several different levels in their career.
I love that. Half of the reason, maybe 75% of the reason I became a nurse, as far as that, everything that you were able to do in your career, and there's still more to go. You wear so many different hats and so many different roles, and you bring up a really great point that at each one of those moments, negotiation and expectations will vary. And I'm sure in those roles, they matched what was going on or met your needs in your life. So I look forward to also hearing about that piece of when we talk about negotiation or thinking about packages that will change over the span of our careers as well. So thank you, ladies, for being here with us today. I want to start off with, this podcast episode is titled How to Negotiate Your Best Nursing Compensation. I want to share that Nurse.org in 2024 did a survey, and nearly 2/3 of the nurses reported being underpaid, and share that their top motivator for leaving their current role was to make more money. And that was tied with frustration with current administration. And that was about 26% of the respondents saying that they plan to leave and that being their reason. And no matter how much you love being a nurse and it's a calling and you're great at it, if you can't pay for your basic living, another common thing is that nurses can't afford their student loans or to pay their student loans in a sustainable way. What are you left to do? And so in today's episode, we hope to help you think about how to negotiate your salary, give you tools to secure competitive compensation, look at different roles, share why negotiation isn't as straightforward and kind of in every scenario and what to consider, and then to talk about as an individual and an organizational, hopefully to influence your perspective and changing your mindset around what does compensation mean, from an individual perspective. What are your non-negotiables for yourself, and kind of maybe start there. And then for organizations, if we're saving money, quote unquote, upfront with keeping costs down with salaries, but are constantly seeing turnover, is that wise? And so we'll touch on all of those things, and we'll get started. So, first question to our negotiation expert: what does it mean to negotiate when we're talking about, or advising someone, try to go out and negotiate? What does that mean, kind of in theory and then in real life?
Thank you. I'm glad we could start here because negotiations is one of those topics that, a lot in a lot of contexts, if you have students coming into the classroom, right, or all kinds of things like that, it is good. Oftentimes it is good that people have prior experience with whatever subject you're going to be talking about. Negotiations is one of those where a lot of times it is almost tricky for people to lean in too hardly into the assumptions that they have. And why I'm saying this is we have basically all heard about negotiations, and it doesn't, it doesn't take, you might have never taken a class, never watched, never attended any workshop, any training at all in negotiations, but you are bound to have a pretty clear idea in your mind of what a negotiation is. And part of that is because it is a pretty fascinating topic, and we're exposed to negotiations through movies, through books, and through anecdotal stories. The uncle, or the great uncle at Thanksgiving who loves sharing his successful negotiation story. Now, what I want to point out, though, is that the stories that are worth, sharing over Thanksgiving dinner or writing a book or a movie about are invariably exceptional cases. Okay, so those are, if you think about the distribution of what negotiations are in real life, those are at the very tail end. And what happens is that our idea of what a negotiation is becomes over-anchored on these sort of really extreme cases. And what I really want to start the conversation today is encouraging our listeners to revisit some of those assumptions and some of those preconceived ideas of what negotiations are. Okay, so this portrayal, if you think about it, what makes a book or a good movie about negotiations? It's, something really out there, right? Really extreme behavior. And in almost all cases, what those are really aggressive negotiations, right? Really extreme behavior that ended up against all odds to end up, being in someone's favor or not. It is portrayed as a pretty selfish, behavior, almost a little bit as a dirty word. And I think that is so problematic because the vast majority of negotiations that we actually encounter in real life are not like that. Okay, so that idea of a selfish, right, of a negotiation as being sort of like a fight between two sides is a very small type of negotiation. It's what we call the distributive negotiation. And the idea behind that is it's a negotiation that entails a fixed pie. Okay, so anything I gain is my counterpart's loss, and anything that my counterpart gains is invariably my loss. Now, that is only a very small type of negotiations in real life. The vast majority of negotiations are actually what we call integrative negotiations. And I actually love that word because it does begin to describe, what it actually is. And vast majority of negotiations that we're going to face, and I would venture to say almost all the negotiations that nurses in particular might face in their life, they're actually this second type of integrative negotiations. And no movies are, books are written about those. So, and what's an integrative negotiation? It's a negotiation that has a lot of different issues at stake. Even if you might not think about it immediately, they are. And we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later on, I'm sure. But the general idea is that it's a process where you can work together. If you do the negotiation properly, what the negotiation is a joint process of figuring out, is there something that I value more than you do? Is there something that you value more than I do? And then let's make a trade-off where we both end up better off than we would have otherwise. And so remember the fixed pie analogy that I was mentioning earlier on, right, about those distributive negotiations? An integrative one is a pie that you can grow. You can actually, if you think about a pizza dough, right? Like if you work together, you can grow that pie. And in the end of the process, both sides sometimes may even end up in a better place with more value created than if they had just, gone into the negotiation right away and split it. So the bottom line is negotiations are not a selfish thing to do. And it's also not something that you're just born knowing how to do or not knowing how to do, right? It is something that you can learn. And it is not incompatible at all with someone who feels, that they're in their job out of vocation, right? I really want my hope is that by the end of this episode, people can sort of recognize that even if you are in a vocation sort of field, that is not incompatible with negotiating, because negotiating is not this selfish act that we're sort of led to believe it is.
I really appreciate you pulling out the piece around it's not a selfish act, because in nursing, where it is such a selfless profession, where majority of the profession are women, and so just from society expectations, set from the beginning of times is that you just give, and it is selfish to ask for more. And that brings up one time, I remember a CNO, I was a nurse manager, so it was like some nurse managers, directors of nursing together, and our CNO was getting a promotion, and we were like, it's like a bigger job. She was our CNO, she was going, like, her scope was expanding significantly, and we were the type of group who would be like, so you're getting the big bucks now, right? And, she was like, oh no, I don't like, I'm just happy to have the job. We're like, you're not going to negotiate. But it was so eye opening. Someone who had been a senior leader for so long, we looked up to, who got so much work done and accomplished so much. And she, I think it was that she felt selfish was what she was saying. Like, I'm happy to have the promotion and to be of service. And, I think about her workload, with no exaggeration, quadrupled at the very least, if not more. And, it was probably just there was no negotiation. I'm not even going to talk about like to what degree or what it potentially was to see that not happen. And so that is a big piece of it. And so thank you for saying that it's not selfish. I love the phrase integrative negotiation. I think, if we do any and everything in an integrative way, the outcomes will be greater for both. So now I will look at piece of dough completely different and use that analogy. Thank you for that. And so with knowing that it's not selfish and there are different things that the scenario that you said of give and take and what's of value to you or not, Kim, I want to know, what are some unique negotiation factors that nurses should think about? What do you advise, or what are you seeing people ask for, and or what are you, as someone who's over that area, kind of offering?
I would start by thinking of what's really the big picture. And part of the big picture is, your compensation package is more than your salary. So it's lots of other benefits that have dollar value attached to them: retirement, loan repayment, continuing education, etc. But it depends on the setting that you're in when you're negotiating. So if you're in a setting where there's thousands of people in your role, you're an RN in a large health system without an administrative component to their job, you probably are not going to have one of the movie-worthy experiences in negotiation that Katerina talked about, because there's so many people that have that same essential skill set as you. but you might then move on to become an advanced practice nurse, a nurse practitioner, et cetera, where you can directly bill third-party payers and bring in a portion of your income. And then that allows you to negotiate incentive plans or negotiate offsets, so that you can directly impact your compensation package. And the problem there, and I know you know this, Alma, is right now in most health systems, nurses at the bedside are not reimbursed by insurance company, by third party payers. They're rolled into the room charges, right? So we're often seen as the largest red item, expensive item on the hospital payroll. So it takes research and policy change to change some of these structural factors that nurses find themselves in when they're negotiating. For example, several years ago, some brilliant nurses and others did research to demonstrate that the more bachelor's prepared and master's prepared nurses you had in the health system, the better the patient outcomes. And that's part of what's going on with magnet health systems. So, as we continue to understand what it means to practice at the top of your license. And, I can, if you'll allow me to go back 25 years, I can tell you there were times when working as a nurse in a health system on the night shift, there was no housekeeping, environmental services. So the nurses cleaned the toilets and mopped the floors and what have you. And I'm horrified to say that I've learned that some of this still goes on with nurses to this day. So if you see nurses leaving the health system, we need to think about what are we asking nurses to do that's not at the top of their license, because there are non-compensation things that drive people to the next position as well.
That's right. That is so true. And you touched on a very, I think, important point where there are things within our control as individuals and as organizations on a smaller level. But then overall, and I know that there's a lot of advocacy happening around financial reimbursement for nurses and healthcare systems. And yes, if we have to walk away from being a part of a room charge and really make these business cases up front. And one way to really, I know, to just shift is to really, have that fee for service. And so if you can, and that is something you're passionate about, please, look up what is happening on the national level to advocate for nurses' financial kind of like models to be reconsidered. And that is something, the other piece that you said that I think goes into direct compensation for when you're negotiating, or when I think about it is, when people walk away, is it solely, what was the tie was frustration with administration and not getting paid enough. And, I think some people, and I've definitely been in this situation where I'm thinking, I don't get paid enough for everything that I'm actually responsible for. And sometimes that's just and a lot of times that's in pure scope, even if it's not like tapping into the responsibility of literally another person's role when you talk about cleaning and transporting and, all of the things that nurses push through or help make happen. And so that is a real big piece that I think when we're thinking about negotiations, what are the different things that we're considering? How overwhelmed are we at work? And for organizations to think about, sometimes it's not, or no, I think the research has proven that it's not always about pay, but also a piece of how people are being treated and respected in their role. And yeah, and then, I guess as individuals, we have to just try to know that things are not selfish. This isn't selfish work, and that there are things outside of your control. And so to plan within your control, because there are definitely structural things in play, such as stark pay gaps. And so I want to share some of the data around pay gaps. And I want to know if reactions from you both, or responses, I should say. So the first one, despite women comprising the majority of the nursing workforce, male registered nurses earn on average $14,000 more annually than their female counterparts. And then follows, nurses of color, particularly Black and Latina women, earn considerably less than white male nurses, sometimes only making 60 to 65 cents for every dollar earned by their male white peers. And the other thing that is very, I think challenging as well is just that there are disparities with actual salaries across the United States. And so when we think about things or giving even advice today, for the listeners, we understand and know that what is happening on the West Coast is different than the South. If even in, New York, if you're in the city, there's going to be a difference. And I know many people who travel into, I'm based in New York City, that will travel into New York City from Long Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut to provide care and get work at a higher rate to then bring back. And so there's a disparity there with where you live and how much you're able to be compensated. And so the US Bureau of Labor Statistics says this gap in nursing can range easily with $100,000 difference. And that's substantial. And so, and nor sustainable, I guess, where you have people kind of leaving their own communities to get higher wages.
And
Yeah.
if I may, I mean, you're describing it one way, but you could even describe it the other way, right? You're describing it as you live, in Pennsylvania or New Jersey, and then you go to New York to work. To me, the systemic problem is that a salary earned in New York City does not allow you to live there.
Yes.
That is, to me, the problem, right? So you are working in New York City and you need to live, one or two states away. I think this is actually the more accurate description of where the problem lies.
That's right.
Is that salaries that are earned in that metropolitan area do not allow someone to, to earn enough to even live in that metropolitan area, which is, I think, just really symptomatic.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. You have employers paying people does not match cost of living. And, I think they'll say that this is market rate, but the market rate is not matching cost of living, which I think goes back to, what Kim was sharing earlier, how we're seeing nursing is seen as an expense. And so therein lies some tension.
In academia, so people that are typically doctorally prepared and they're educators and researchers, at a large school like Emory, the provost office does a deep dive on salaries at least once a year, where we need to justify, we cut the pie up by age, race, scholarly productivity, ethnicity, gender, every possible way. And anyone that falls outside, the sort of norms has to be justified. So I think there are some institutions that work very hard to identify these disparities and correct them. The other thing that I see in nursing, so in Atlanta, 11% of our students are male. On the West Coast, 17% of our students were male. So as you mentioned, there were gender differences based on the region, but still that's 1 in 5 nurses or less, are going to be men. That's a very low number. And yet what we see is they increasingly move to administrative roles much more quickly. Once you're in an administrative role where you can argue for your value added to the institution, and there's fewer people in that role, you have more negotiating power. So that may be what we're seeing, is that if we have these vast disparities, it may be because people are reaching out and being given the opportunity to take on some administrative tasks. So that's perhaps what we need to look at, is what's that race and age and gender disparity on who applies for and is given the opportunity to do a more specialized job.
That's so true. And that's a form of negotiation. I want to hand it over back to Katerina. Can you give us some tried and true tactics?
Yeah, I mean, actually, before I would love to talk about tactics. Before that, I actually think it would be helpful to talk a little bit about the systemic issue and what's behind, some of the stats, that you were sharing earlier. So, the first thing I want to make clear here is that in talking about negotiations, a lot of time people attribute it to, oh, I just don't know how to negotiate, right? Or I'm not good at negotiating, or we as nurses are not good at negotiating. And I want to make it really clear. Nurses are at a very strong systemic disadvantage when it comes to negotiating. Okay, so it is not a problem of the nurses or a problem of you not knowing how to negotiate. Now, that is not to say that there are not things that you can do individually, and I would love to have a conversation about that, and I do have some specific suggestions. But understanding this is a systemic problem. Okay, this is a societal problem, and there are a lot of forces that have pushed you into being in a really hard situation. So talking a little bit about that. So there are 2 to 3 of the strongest biases that can exist in a society, basically pushing nurses down. And you've already mentioned them, right? One is it's a traditionally female-dominated field. And so there's a very strong gender dynamic there. It is also, there's also a very strong hierarchy dynamic, right? And I mentioned earlier, right? Like these are things, everywhere I look, I sort of see hierarchy, right? But I don't need to be the one telling you, right? Every single conversation I have with a nurse, the same, 1 or 2 minutes into the conversation comes some comment about the hierarchy, about how hierarchical the structure is and how nurses are systematically positioned in the lower, hierarchical positions within the healthcare system. And that doesn't correspond to the value and the critical value of the work that they're contributing, right? But there's this stereotype and this bias that sort of systematically pushes them to the bottom of the hierarchy. And then in some places, there's also racial, dynamics, and you can really see the racial split as you look up and down the hierarchy in the healthcare system, how racially segregated they are. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places in the country. So you basically have 2 or 3 of the strongest biases that are sort of pushing nurses into a really tough spot. Okay. And so into traditionally, you have these multiple stereotypically low status, basically, characteristics, and that are pushing you down. Not only and what that does is it pushes down your expectations about whether you're allowed to negotiate. And then if you do try, and take the risk of negotiating, it is also pushing down your power. Okay. So this is sort of a bleak picture, but just because it's bleak, believe me, it goes a really long way to even just call it out for what it is, right? I'm a really strong believer in the power of diagnosis. Just knowing that the system is working against you, I think can be a little bit empowering, right? Knowing it's not it's not that you were not trained or you don't have it in you, right? There are actual forces that have worked against you, right? It's the exact opposite of a privilege, right? Where you don't recognize how many things have been helping you. Here, it goes a really long way to acknowledge, what has hurt you. And the immediate good news coming out of that, okay, so let's now shift into positive, is no matter what you think you're allowed to negotiate, and no matter how much you think you are worth, I can basically be pretty sure that you are undervaluing it, that you're undervaluing yourself, and you are underestimating how much space you might actually have to negotiate. Again, because everything is pushing you down. So the reality is probably somewhere higher up than where you think it is. So gender, for example, I think is a really interesting one to be specific about how this works. So there's a stereotype that women are less skilled at negotiating than men. And that stereotype is wrong. So there's a lot of evidence. And one of the strongest pieces of evidence about this is if you put a man and a woman negotiating, if the woman is negotiating on behalf of someone else, she is equally effective as a man negotiating. There's no gap. It is when they're negotiating for themselves that the gap comes in. And what that tells you is it's not a gap in skills, not a gap in ability, but it is something about how we are socialized to believe that we don't warrant it, right? That we don't deserve it. And that's these are the really strong processes that are working, I think, against nurses. So a big conversation that we need to be having is again, changing these assumptions, changing this perspective. And I can give you an example of how we're socialized into this. I have young kids. I have 2 girls and 1 boy. And there are a lot of anecdotal stories. And I even think there's some research around this, but little girls are corrected a lot more for coloring outside of the lines, right? So if you imagine a classroom, right, with 2 or 3-year-olds and they're, given these coloring sheets, a girl is more likely to be corrected if she's coloring outside of the lines than a boy is. And this is just one of 1,000 examples of how we're socialized differently. And what it means is when those kids reach adult life, there's a fascinating statistic which says so much, which is basically men apply to a job as soon as they feel they meet about 60 or 70% of the qualifications that the job asks for. Women wait until they meet 100%, right? So what this shows you is that there's a different understanding about the rules of the game. And the lines are not as black and white as probably, a lot of our listeners assume they are, right? So just because something hasn't been done before, you haven't heard about something being done, it doesn't mean that it is not worth the ask. So I hope this, gives a little bit of context. Again, it's a bleak picture, right? I wish it were not this way, but I think it's one calling out that this is a systemic problem that goes way back to, as we work to solve and address all kinds of other issues, we'll be working, towards improving a lot of issues together, but also realizing that it's no surprise, right, that you feel this way. You are entitled to feel frustrated around this topic, but that knowledge can and should be empowering to, let's do something about it.
Agreed. We have to be real about where we're at and committed for our own kind of growth and advocacy. And then, for whoever, and we, and when you advocate for yourself and speak up for yourself, that is giving other people that empowerment to do that for themselves. And then there's that ripple effect. And then with anybody with a little bit more capacity or bandwidth in the moment to then advocate for, whether it's your hospital, whether it's your state, whether it's on the national level, of helping kind of right these wrongs. And as you said, so there we do have to own it. And I think what I've definitely been noticing, this is pre-pandemic, but then post-pandemic, that nurses are really showing up and impacting the way not only the nursing profession is moving, and professional associations are following, hospitals are following, which tend to be the largest place in nursing homes where nurses are at in these kind of like acute or subacute areas. They're having to respond to the workplace. So I think keep naming it, keep asking for what you deserve. You, Katarina, you hit on that. We often, and I'm guilty of this, we all, I did this or I did that, when really the impact is much larger. And so own your worth. And on that, I want to talk about what are ways to kind of own your worth? What are ways to get compensated for it? And I'll kind of start from thinking from a clinical nurse perspective, or being like what I would help the clinical nurses do when I was a nurse manager. So there are ways to negotiate, or things to think about, is just, if you have the skills of leading a team and you're a charge nurse, you get paid more for that, right? And I know some listeners might roll their eyes like it's not that much money, but it's really setting the stage for you practicing how to negotiate, how to continue to assess your skills and make sure you're getting compensated for them, right? And so otherwise, if you're not the charge nurse, or you're not officially a preceptor, but you're always the person educating people, you're always the person de-escalating and helping, with the operations of the unit, go ahead and get that title and that compensation. And what I think naturally could happen as well is that you understand or get to experience what you're great at, and have official kind of documented proof of your impact. And so maybe that means you continue to grow in place, both professionally and financially, or then you then start thinking about going on to another role. As nurse managers, always encouraging the nurses to get certified, to go get their degrees, to highlight, like sometimes people say, to think about when you're negotiating, you're going to go to the bigger campus to get more money, but then you're going to lose all the compensation package in this current campus because maybe there's just like a difference, or you have to start over. I would help the nurses kind of brainstorm in that way. Tuition reimbursement is a real big one if that's a goal. So, right now you might not be taking it home in direct money, but you're at a place where you want to get an advanced degree, and you think about depending on where you're at, some of these institutions are giving huge tuition reimbursements, and that is with no commitment or low commitment as far as like staying with the organization. What else comes to mind? So the certifications, advanced degrees, reimbursement, understanding what your full package is, thinking about when you're negotiating PTO as well. I've had a couple of people say that they stayed in a role because they were able to keep a schedule that allowed them to either, one, have another job, and maybe we'll get to that, and two, just have like a quality of life that they felt like if they took a higher paying job would bring in more money, but wouldn't give them that quality of life. And so different ways, I think, to navigate kind of like the challenges that are systemic when it comes to negotiating or thinking about getting the best compensation.
Hey nurses, looking for exclusive discounts? Nurse.org has you covered with deals on everything. Save big on the essentials you need to excel in your career. Don't miss out. Visit nurse.org/discounts for the latest discounts made just for you.
Kim, what are some thoughts? How do you advise? Kim also has a daughter who's a nurse, and in your position as you're recruiting and helping the university keep faculty? What are some things that you see that aren't just about the salary?
So just so many things you said
Yeah.
resonated with me, throughout my career. I have lived all of those things that you just said. So I'm so excited trying to decide where to even jump in. I think maybe the charge nurse idea. Let me start with that. You know, I hear a lot of people say, well, why would I want $3 or $4 more an hour to have this kind of headache? And I would say that as long as I've been in administration, so maybe the last 20, 15, 20 years, I have a new appreciation and understanding for what big problems the people who make decisions in an organization are dealing with, and how we look to people who report to us to help us identify and solve big problems. So, charge nurse, for example, that is still done, at least at my institution. I'm going to tell you about yours. Scheduling is still from the charge nurse, and it's still done where you email your charge nurse the days you do and don't want to work, and the charge nurse prints it all out, puts it on the dining room table, and figures out, you know, uh, and that's a crazy use of a nurse's time, right? That's not practicing at the top of your license. So I think particularly we're in an interesting point right now where we have a lot of AI integrated solutions that are developing in real time, and that administrators, including me, are on the bleeding edge of figuring out what's aspirational and what's really what can we use right now. So I guarantee that Delta pilots don't, put their schedules out on the dining room table to figure out who should work which shifts. I'm sure there's a system, a program that does that. So I think we need to help our leaders identify the problems in a positive way, right? Identify them in a positive way and come to the table with some potential solutions. Here's a new AI integrative solution that could help with scheduling, that could help with, when the scanner doesn't work and then the nurse has to literally hand enter barcode items and lot numbers and things like that. So anything that moves the nurse away from the patient, moves the nurse away from critical thinking, moves away from the soft skills that AI cannot do for us. And so that we can really lean into AI to do those tasks that machines and algorithms, machine learning is quite good at, and then allows the nurses to do the things that we all believed we were wanting to do as we went into this profession. So I think understanding, just literally having a conversation with your direct report, what are your biggest challenges? What can I help you with? And understanding what their problems are, so that you can, sort of get on the same side, rowing in the same direction, if you will, about how to solve some of these systemic problems. And I've seen a lot of things get better in my career. And I've seen a lot that, wow, we're still doing that. And as I mentioned, we're still cleaning toilets in some places. That's crazy. So I think helping administrators in a positive way know where the challenges are and where you could raise your hand to say, I have a potential solution for this problem. I'd love to pilot it, see if it works for our unit, our institution. And I guarantee you that even if the solution is not exactly what the manager is looking toward, I bet they're looking to solve the same problem that the nurse is raising their hand to solve. So I wouldn't be afraid to lean into opportunities, to pilot new things, have stretch goals, things that for the dollar per hour doesn't really seem like it would be worth that, but it puts you in a situation where you're closer to being at the table so you can be involved in bigger decisions.
Absolutely. And so that could be charge nurse, that could be leading. A lot of organizations have professional governance or share governance. It's called different things, leading those committees. And then, yes, as you said, like collaborating with leadership to move the needle. Then seeing what your impact is like, or practice, putting those skills to work. And if and that also feeds into promotional opportunities, or moving out of, you talk about the bands where you're in a role where there's, hundreds or thousands of people, then you become like a clinical nurse specialist or a nurse project manager. There's different roles where you could still use your nursing skills and then obviously elevate your compensation. Katerina, what are some things, hearing that, in some parts it's so tight, in other places you have flexibility, and you said, we don't know our worth, but like, Could you say the top three either mindsets, and maybe it's not top three, you could pick however, when wanting to go into a negotiation, what kind of things you should consider before starting the conversation?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that a lot of what both of you have shared fits it. You're talking from experience, but it's exactly it's a practical demonstration of all the conceptual ideas that come from negotiation research. So it's fascinating to sort of hear you talk about. So some of the things I'm going to mention actually speak directly to things both of you have already mentioned earlier. But yeah, so I think one of the big things in a negotiation is that most of the work that you can do is actually going into the preparation for the negotiation. So I actually do have like three thoughts to share, and two of them have to do with preparation. Okay, so and that is and that is reflective of how important thinking about the two things are. And again, the movies and the books, what they talk about is a lot of times how the negotiation happened, and they leave out of the story the preparation, right, which is actually where most of the value is created. So a big thing in preparation. So a really big thing in a negotiation is you want to bring to your table as many of what we call issues in a negotiation, issues related to the negotiation as possible. And what do I mean by issues? I mean, right, so salary is an obvious issue, right? But there are a lot of other aspects of your job. And any of those other aspects of your job can and should be considered an issue in your negotiation, or at least in your preparation. So the more issues you can bring to the table, the more opportunities you might have to be able to identify those trade-offs that allow for what we were talking earlier about, the integrative negotiation, the growing the pie. Growing that dough, that pie, comes from bringing as many issues into the table and being able to trade them off. Okay. And what I want to especially, give advice in this regards is we tend to overvalue and over anchor on quantitative issues, especially financial issues. And those are important, but they are by no means the only issues on the table. Okay, so this is where, and I'm going to throw up some ideas, but I'm not a nurse, I'm not even in healthcare, right? So I'm probably not going to mention the right things, but I want to give you examples, and I want each of listeners to really reflect on, be creative and be open-minded in the exercise that I'm asking you to do. So thinking salary, and I'll talk about salary in just a minute, but consider issues like vacation days, sick days, learning days, right? Days in the year that you can take off to do training and development, right? Schedule flexibility, both in terms of days and hours, childcare support on a regular basis, childcare support when they're sick, moving support, tuition reimbursement, again, and that can be partial, it can be full, but anything is helpful. Financial support for future training, right, or education that you might want to do. Compensation for extra role, right, and service work that you do. And again, as you said, I think is a really good point. It's not so much about the quantity that you get. So don't dismiss things even if they're paid very little, because it's a signal that you're sending. No matter what I'm doing, I expect to be compensated for extra role work, right? And so you're setting that standard, that expectation, both to you and to the organization, goes a really long way, because then those things all add up. The team you work on, right? Both in terms of think about both supervisors and peers. Again, you may know more than I do. I'm sure you know more than I do, right? But the idea here is be creative and don't undervalue the non-financials, because the more issues that you can bring into the table, the more opportunity there may be to trade off. And one thing I want to mention is a lot of these things that I mentioned, if you come to think of them, if those things are secure, you're actually going to be allowed to do your job better, which in the end of the day is in service of the organization that you're working with. So that's the narrative that you want to bring, right? Is maybe you're in a position where they say salary is not negotiable, right? Because it's this standard, it's set. And I'm actually going to speak in a minute to what Kim was also mentioning about, right, where you are in your career, right? But even if salary is not negotiable, you can turn and say, I understand that, but there are many other things about my job that I want to, to talk with you about, right? Where, and I want to talk with you about them because if we can work together in helping me secure these other dimensions of my life and my work, I am going to be able to do my job better, which at the end of the day, I know is in your interest, right? So it's about framing it in this way. It's extremely respectful, right, of your counterpart, right? Going back to the point about, it's not about you saying, I want this because I want it. right? You're not a toddler throwing a tantrum, right? You're saying this, I want this because this allows me to do my job better, which is what you want in the end of the day. So I mentioned, I just wanted to also just add something about salary. So salary is a really important element, of course, and there is a lot of work that you can do. So I really strongly encourage everyone, when thinking about salary, go look for comps, right? The same way that you would look for comps when you're looking to buy a house or buy a car. Go online, right? Nowadays, there is a lot of good comp information online. Your school databases. This is one a lot of times people don't think about, but the school you went to has a database of the salaries that people got, right, not only right after graduating, but a lot of times the schools make a point of keeping those databases updated. And a lot of times all it takes is reaching out to the school and asking, like, for this band or this level or these many years out, do you have any data about this? And the school is more than happy to share that with you, right, because they want their alumni to do well. So tap into that resource. And then if I also add another place where you can go, this is if you can create a group of peers, either because you went to school with, if you are at different institutions, the better. But the idea is a group of peers, and you can commit to always remaining, a little bit of a share, an internal database, right? And you can keep it confidential between the 10, between the 5 or the 10 of you. But imagine the power of having this group of peers spread across the country at different institutions and different levels, where you commit to always share any update to your compensation. And again, I'm not talking just salary. I'm talking about salary, but all of these other things as well, right? Imagine how helpful it can be to keep that group for 20, 30, 40 years in your career, right? And you always update each other. So that's sort of like a simple idea. So that was suggestion number 1, right? So bring as many issues into consideration, especially those non-financial ones, or don't disregard those non-financial ones. A second advice comes from, there's this term in negotiations, which we call BATNA. Okay, so BATNA. And it stands for your best alternative to negotiated agreement. Okay, this is like class 101. Every negotiation, class in the country, like the first class, the first week, you introduce this concept. And what it means is, what are you going to do if this falls through, right? So what are you going to do if you leave your job? What are you going to do if you don't get this promotion? What are you going to do if you don't get this job that you're applying to? Most of the time, what that means is you want to know what job you could have instead. And what I'm going to say here is a little bit, initially, I think a lot of people sort of take this the wrong way the first time I mentioned this. But the advice that I'm really giving you is, on a really regular basis, apply to other jobs. That does not mean you are going to take those other jobs. I am actually encouraging you to apply to jobs that at the end of the day, you would never take. But the knowledge and the information that you can gain from that process is really valuable. And it's both the information that you're going to find out from that process, but also the confidence that you know how to do this. So that the day that you do want to change jobs, you're like, okay, this is not, you're not going to be procrastinating rather than pushing it off for 2 or 3 years. So applying to jobs gives you information about how much you're worth, right? And again, this doesn't mean that you're going to share with your superior or your organization, that you got an alternative offer. If you got an alternative offer that is definitely more competitive than what you're getting now, then there are very, sort of professional ways in which you can approach your manager and say, I'm coming to you. The first thing I want to say is I want to continue working with this organization. I am very happy here. But I also want to share with you that I've had an update on how much the market is valuing the experience that I have at this point. And I think this warrants a revisiting of our conversation, because I'm not the same employee that I was, when I joined 3 years ago. Right. And so I think it's worth updating. Right. So there are very sort of elegant ways to have that. Even suggesting applying to jobs even beyond that purpose, just for your personal knowledge of how much you're worth and how much the field would be willing to pay for you, so that you can have that information in hand, right? And then decide what to do with it or not. So this idea of the BATNA, right? What are you going to do if this falls through? Also think about it on the other side. In other words, what is your organization's BATNA? So what is your organization going to do if they lose you or if they don't hire you? And this is where I love that, Kim, you brought this up earlier, where you are in your career, right? So if you're really early on your career and you're thinking, okay, what is the organization going to do if they don't hire me, right? Or if they lose me, then the answer is pretty straightforward. They're just going to hire someone that looks like you, or hire someone else instead. But pretty soon in your career, you're going to start having experiences that make you just a little bit more unique. Even the fact that you now know the organization, that you have now been here for a year, already means that it's expensive for the organization to lose you and to have to hire someone who goes back to square one, who doesn't know the organization. And that should be factored into your value. As you gain more experience, and this is where also sometimes having those extra roles can be so valuable, right? Because it is giving you your experience, you're making yourself more unique. And so it makes, again, replacing you, losing you, more expensive for the organization. And the more expensive it is for the organization to lose you, the more negotiation power you have, right? Because in other words, the more the organization will be willing to give you in order to not incur in that cost of losing you. And I know, in previous conversations with you and with others, that there are some initiatives in the field, in the nursing, to quantify the cost of nursing turnover and burnout. And if I can, really encourage, if anyone, if you and anyone listening is involved in that process or can do something to contribute to that effort, that is going to be immensely valuable. Because again, it's this idea, right? If a hiring organization knows how much it costs to lose you, that is going to put you in much better position to negotiate, because they're going to see it is worth it to retain you, right? To pay to retain you. And I said 3, right? So my last piece of advice. So these are some little tricks for the negotiation itself, okay? So first thing, you want to think about a target, right? What is your goal? What is it that you want to ask for ideally? And the best way to go through that mental process is think, what would you recommend your best friend in the field? Okay, and you mentioned something earlier on, right? Also about like this manager that you mentioned that you really admired, how clear it was to all of you that she deserved a raise, and she didn't think she deserved it, right? That's what I mean. I know each of you are going to be much more generous and honest and accurate when assessing how much a friend deserves compared to when you're thinking about how much you deserve. So put on that hat, right? Think, what would I recommend my friend? And that's a mindset that you want to, recommend to yourself. And also, if you don't ask for something, you're not going to get it, right? No one is going to hand it to you, right? So there's no sort of falling from the sky. It is up to you. And almost always the worst case scenario is if they say no, you just end up where you are anyway. So the potential benefit is so big. And if you think about it, the cost is really, it's psychological, right? So if you can work yourself through it, because practically talking, you're just going to stay where you are. Also, sometimes, you go into a conversation, the first thing that your counterpart says is, we can't negotiate salary. Like, I don't even know why you're here, right? And again, this is where you can bring in that preparation that you did and saying, I understand that, but actually there are a lot of other things that I think are worth discussing beyond salary, right? So you frame yourself in that way, right? You say, I am worth talking, even if your standards, right, are different. And then related to this, sometimes there are questions you just don't want to answer, and you have the right not to answer them. And my suggestion is just be prepared to give those non-answers. So I can give you one example. A lot of times recruiters, and this is not just in healthcare, but in everywhere, they will ask you, what's your current salary, right? Or what's your previous salary in your previous organization? It is almost never in your interest to reveal that number, okay? And people find it really hard to not answer that question, right? Because you're being asked a direct question, and then how do you say, well, I actually don't want to share that, right? So here's a great answer that you can give instead. What you can say is, I understand why you're asking me that question, but here's the thing. I'm such a better fit for your organization or for this new role than I was in my previous role. And you are signaling not only that you're motivated to work with them, right, and the value that you're going to be delivering, but you're explaining that that previous reference point is not a relevant, or that previous salary is not a relevant reference point, right? So you can say, I'm such a better fit for this organization because of the experience that I have gained in the meantime, right? Or because because this position really leverages, the recent experience that I had, or the recent education, or update in my training. So that previous salary is not relevant reference point. But let me tell you what I do think are valid reference points. And then you bring in the numbers that your preparation and your homework revealed, right? So those conversations with friends, right? The databases, the information that the school gave you, right? All that comp information. You can say, I did an analysis of comps, and this is a number that I do think is a fair compensation for what I would be doing to you. And you avoided answering that question in a really professional, and positive way towards your new employer, right? No one is ever going to insist after hearing that answer. So I hope those are helpful and practical.
So helpful. That was so much. And, God, I was like making different notes to respond. And while I'll go in definitely order of the not answering that question, it's actually illegal in New York City to ask that question. I imagine in other places it may or may not, but I think that just shows, or, for the listener to know that it really is not in your best interest that, a law was made to make sure that people don't ask that. So you aren't taken advantage of in this moment.
In so many places, it's illegal to ask if you have kids, and yet they find a way
Yeah.
in the conversation to find out if you have kids,
Yep.
right? So
right.
It's
No, that's so true. So a lot of preparation, and a lot of preparation. And I think how I heard the preparation was partly do your own assessment of like what you value, what you need, what value you bring to work. And then that preparation of like what's happening externally in your market, and, maybe what's even happening within your own organization, finding out what's happening when you're talking to your peers. I also wanted to plug, that was the other thing. Nurse.org has, salary guides and caps for every role, not just in nursing, but in healthcare. So definitely check out nurse.org for that, as well as, and I got this when I was reading an article on nurse.org, Vivian Healthcare has a real-time salary comparison. So you can put like role, zip code, and you'll find out hourly rate. And so I was playing with that a couple of nights ago, and it was spot on. And when I say role, even like specialty, so I can say like if I'm an ICU nurse in Florida versus a med surg nurse in Florida, and so on and so forth. So there are many resources out there for you to get that concrete data, so that you can be informed. And can you say BATNA, what is it again?
So it's best alternative to a negotiated agreement.
Okay. Yeah.
The way to think about it is like, what am I going to do instead, right? If this falls through.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's stay in my current job, right? Sometimes it's, buy another car. Sometimes it's, go, do a staycation instead of a vacation, right? So I'm just giving examples of, it is literally, what are you going to do instead? And sometimes it's, if I don't take this job, I'm going to take that other job, right? And those are more obvious, they're more similar, but sometimes the alternative is staying where you are. And sometimes people forget to think that is actually, the relevant.
Right. I love that. As you said, like there's the theory, the practical piece, and then the theory. So when I heard you say that, I was like, that is kind of how I try to approach many decisions. It's just like, what happens if I don't do anything versus like, what are my options to act? And then kind of, doing an analysis and seeing where that should fall. So I have a new phrase to use to elevate my decision tree. So within your three things that you shared, there were even many takeaways, if you will. And so I want to know from each one of you, and maybe I'll start with just some takeaways, but you can just think about just offering to our listeners some biggest takeaway for people to kind of remember when it comes to best negotiation. And so things that I've practiced and did not practice, but then definitely when I became a leader would really encourage my clinical nurses, because I think that's the group that feels, rightfully so, like there's not many options. And so what I want listeners to take away or remember when it comes to negotiation, it's more than just the dollar amount. But my unpopular one is what you said, and I was surprised to hear you say that, is you don't have to stay in an organization forever. And that used to be the case. But unfortunately, when you get even promoted internally, you're going to, not make as much as if you went from org to org to org. Do that where it makes sense, where you're really learning and adding value and can take that experience. So I'm not just saying hop to make money, but it does not serve you when it comes to compensation. The system, right? Like, this is another system issue, is like loyalty is not compensated at the same rate as taking your skills to different organizations. And so, I was someone who stayed at an organization for a very long time. And when I look back at, or when it became very obvious to me when I would work with, when nurse managers would come and I was still in the same, organization, same nurse manager role. And in that time, they had about 3 jobs, and they were, making some more change because they moved around to different organizations. And so at every level that can happen, within or at the center of that is choose you and choose what's best for you. And so spend time. And so that can mean moving around in organizations. That can mean taking 2 per diem jobs versus a full-time job. Just really get creative and prioritize your needs. And so doing, I guess, not just applying to the jobs. Maybe my biggest takeaway is be creative and think about different ways that you could be compensated, and not just follow kind of the past, the traditional ways of thinking about how to negotiate. There's these bigger packages. There's so many other options than to just stay in a role for a long time. And so that's definitely a takeaway, a good reminder and practice for myself, and definitely for the listeners. So I'll go to Kim and then Katarina. What's your biggest takeaway that you want people to kind of remember from today's discussion?
So I hope that people hear us when we talk about salary bands and how funds flow within an organization. So what the person you're negotiating with has the power to do within those bands, both salary and other compensation variables that you and Katerina both talked about. So in academia, for example, our national organization, the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, once a year gets real salary data from all schools of nursing all over the country and publishes them in a book. And it's available to the public. You can find this information. And so then those of us that are hiring academics, we can look by region, by degree of research productivity, whatever, academic health center versus a private nonprofit versus a public school. We can slice this data in different ways to see which set of data best reflect the workforce that we're trying to recruit. And so I think knowing that these sort of things exist and can help you negotiate better, because I get, just for fun, I'll put some job into Glassdoor or ChatGPT or Claude AI or whatever, and I get sometimes some crazy answers that nursing academics make a $1.5 million a year. Well, that's not even the best person in the world comes to me. There's a systems issue. I cannot pay a faculty $1.5 million a year. So I think getting your hands on accurate data, whether you do it through a systematic way like I'm talking about or by interviewing on a regular basis, I think that's really helpful. In academia, I encourage people to interview too. And the reason I do is sometimes you realize how good you have it when you go interview somewhere else, right? And all of us want, happy and productive people around us, right? So if somebody feels like, oh, they just don't quite have a good deal and their attitude has sort of gone sideways, well, sometimes the best thing in the world is to go interview somewhere else and either take the new job, because who wants to feel like that for another 20 or 30 years, right? Or realize that, gosh, there's some really great things where I am now. Like, if you can understand how funds flow in your organization. So academic institutions, either 100% of the funds flow from the revenue stream of the school to the central university, or a smaller percentage of that, 10, 15% flows. And once you understand how that funds flow happens, then you know how much negotiating power the person that you have to negotiate with. And you mentioned my daughter was a nurse. So I said, oh gosh, well, tell them you're multilingual. And I bet that's valued in an organization. And the person that she was negotiating with wasn't the nurse manager. It was someone in a visiting HR system. And they just had a list of bullet points of what you could pay extra for. One was being an LPN. So there was nothing, to pay extra for that had to do with higher education or additional skills. So now that she knows that, as she moves up the ladder, she can be in a position to say, hey, let's consider some other variables that change the base rate of pay. Do we have data that say nurses who can communicate better have fewer bad patient outcomes? If we do, let's put that on the table as something we want to have as part of our negotiation. So I think it's getting our hands on the data, and then seeing if we want to stay where we are. And I'm somebody that has moved around both coasts, moved a lot. So I've been in a lot of different systems, and I see administrators in all of these systems struggling to hope that the people that are reporting to them will help them solve big problems. So I think coming with problems in a positive way with potential solutions is going to be met in a positive way by administrators.
Yeah. Kim, I love your point of getting your hands on accurate data. And sometimes the most accurate data is, and it still ties to like the point that Katarina said, it's just like, go out there and see. I've seen that with peers. I've seen that with people reporting to me. It's just, spend 15 years in a job, like assuming or saying what they could get. And it's just like, that's a big step in, I think, all of this is that you have to put some action to it and not just brew on it, or, as you said, just like do a quick Google search, like really see if that is something that you can get. And so I really love that point of go out there and really see if that grass is greener on the other side.
The takeaway that I really want to emphasize is this point about being in a vocation or on a work is not incompatible with negotiating. And if your assumption, if your current view of negotiations as this selfish act, then I really, really want to encourage you to, work on replacing that by understanding negotiations as being this integrated process, right? Where if you trade off, a lot of times what your counterpart wants is something that you can actually very easily give away. And something that can really improve the way you work can sometimes be something that your counterpart can actually really give away easily as well. So you need to have this be able to be really creative in terms of the issues that you're bringing into consideration, but then having that conversation and framing it both to yourself, right, and to your counterpart as this as a constructive process, to overcome these preconceived ideas of negotiation as something inherently selfish, and understanding that, again, you getting what you need to do your job better is not a selfish act. It is allowing you to do your job better, which is ultimately in service of the organization that is hiring you, right? So going back to that example about, right, the nurses in New York City who need to live 1 or 2 states away, if you want to have this conversation about, let's say, increasing your salary, right, or you've done your due diligence, you've looked at the comps, and you know that you ought to be a little bit higher up on that, right, on that band, or or that there is data out there to show that you could actually have an increase in salary, then the narrative that you can bring to that conversation can be something around, I'm coming to you asking for an increase in salary, right? And I have the data to support that, to show that this is warranted for someone with my experience and, and what I bring to the table. And furthermore, right, I'm coming to you asking for this increase in salary because that increase in salary will allow me to live closer to my job and allow me to, spend just maybe 45 minutes commuting instead of 2 hours, which will substantially improve my, how I show up to work, right? How available I am to, to treating my patients with the care and, that in the end of the day, you hired me to do, right? So frame it about how that thing that you're asking for, that you're negotiating for, is going to allow you to do your job better. And that will help, it will help your counterpart see it as in their interest to meet you where you're asking them to meet you. And also, coming back to this point about this negotiation disadvantage being a systemic issue, also remember, for every one of you who is, negotiating, it's not just about you. it's also, a step in that cog of changing the process, right? Of changing it systemically and changing these stereotypes and these assumptions that are so strongly ingrained in the field. And, if it's not us doing it, then who is, right? So again, but this is a second, a further reinforcement of this idea that negotiating is not a selfish act, right? A part of the benefit of you negotiating is you're going to make the system better for everyone else around you and who comes after you, right? So also keep that in mind when deciding to do so.
That's a great way to end, I think, with the takeaways. How to best get your compensation is to really go out and get your best compensation, because that will ripple into everything that you do, both personally and professionally. And it is a signal to organizations and to the industry in general of what is important. And we've seen those changes when nurses speak up directly and indirectly. All the organizations recently are like, how do we get nurses back into hospitals? Because there are other options. And, so stay empowered, stay in your truth. And I hope that the listeners are able to use the tactics or tools that we talked about today, really digest some of these systemic things that are going on to help you with perspective and mindset, and really go out there and go after that best compensation package that is important to you, because for everybody else, it'll be different depending on where you're at in your career. And so gather that information, go after it. I want to thank Katerina and Kim and Emory University for partnering with Nurse.org on many important topics, specifically today talking money and negotiation, which often is not a common topic in nursing. So really helpful discussion, I think, for the profession and the industry. So thank you both for that. To our listeners, you can find Nurse Converse, Nurse.org's podcast, on all your streaming channels. So that's Apple, YouTube, Spotify. Please listen, like, comment, subscribe, share, do all the things to get the word out that we have the kind of a power and authority to negotiate for ourselves and yet our profession as well. So on that, we will end. Thank you both and have a good day.
Thanks for joining Nurse Converse, brought to you by Nurse.org. Help us grow by leaving a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. Nurse.org supports nurses with career and education tips, life advice, and breaking news. Thank you for all you do and for being you.